From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Welcome once again. During our first half hour, Sarah Moyer has two guests from the 2018 Plant Science Symposium hosted by K-State last week, leading plant scientists from around the nation gathering there. She'll talk with Thomas Sinclair of North Carolina State University about his efforts to modify crop plants for greater water use efficiency, seeking crop genetics that limit the plant's water transpiration rate. And from Purdue University, Mitch Tynstra will talk about his work to improve the climate resilience of corn and grain sorghum, in essence, exchanging the favorable traits of those crops with one another. Also in today, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven with his weekly commentary on rural Kansas, along with more, here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. I'm Sarah Moyer at a Plant Science Symposium here on K-State's campus, and alongside Tom Sinclair, a plant scientist from North Carolina State University. He was a presenter here at the symposium where people have gathered to talk about what the future holds for plant breeding, plant science, and how looking to the climate and the environment that producers will be working in for the future may help them make some decisions on where to move forward. One of the topics that you, Tom, had talked about was how to improve plants, and specifically focusing on water for the future. That's a key element. It's good to have you with us here today. Would you like to give us a brief overview on what the main objective of your presentation was?
We're very interested in water. Of course, water is a limiting factor, or lack of water is a limiting factor in most of the U.S. and obviously in Kansas too. But the predictions are that the infrequency of rainfall is going to happen in the future, which means greater periods of drought. And in the summer months, that it's likely there will be even less rainfall altogether. So these are the real concerns for the future. And my research has been looking at how we can modify plants to deal with having less water for production.
And you made a statement about how agronomists should be looking at the whole season, and as producers are looking at different plant varieties they may be using, looking at how that plant might perform with the water it's given is very important. The switch in the mindset from talking about water efficiency or transpiration efficiency moving to a limited transpiration rate, looking at that kind of figure. Would you explain what the difference is there?
Well, traditionally, physiologists and molecular geneticists who kind of looked at the static measurement, they go out and look at how the leaves are performing in terms of water loss and photosynthesis, and have that one-time measurement and then somehow think that applies to the whole season. And it's clearly not the case. You have to track the water use through the whole season. So my argument is that static transpiration efficiency isn't particularly useful, and we have to track how the water is used through the whole growing season. And particularly what we seem to see is you have to save water earlier in the season so you have enough water to finish out the crop and get mature yield rather than suffer a severe drought earlier in the season.
How does that relate to the figures that you showed early on with projections for 2050?
Well, unfortunately, it's hard to predict the water for the 2050. The temperature predictions under climate change are known within a boundary, but temperature changes aren't really serious for crop production because we have genetic means to change it, and of course the farmers will quickly adjust when they sow to sow earlier so they take advantage of that little warmer temperature. What we don't know is the rainfall. The predictions seem to indicate that the U.S. during the summer will have less rain and that they'll have more intermittent rain. So I'm arguing we need to do this research to get us background information for that case. But even if it doesn't happen, we know water is the problem now, so that whatever we discover, I think, can be applied and is being applied immediately.
What's the trait that you had shown an interesting example with soybeans and how their ability to have that limited transpiration rate was showing up in the field?
Okay, well, generally crops now have been selected and marketed that continue photosynthesis at their maximum rate regardless of what the environment is like. And what we've discovered is that some of the ancient material, native material, actually decrease photosynthesis, have the stomata closed partially during the middle of the day when the air is the driest, the relative humidity is the lowest, and save water by this closure. So they save a bit of water every day that they have this high condition. And by saving the water, then they have more water later in the season to finish out the growth. We've developed commercial lines that have this trait and indeed under drier conditions have the higher yield.
And does sorghum and pearl millet, do they have some traits like this already in them? That was a question and some conversation that went on. Would you explain that?
Well, we've looked at this for this trait in almost every one of the major crops, and we have been able to find some genetic material somewhere for every crop. So it does exist. So the breeding can go on, and it is going on now for most of the crops. Sorghum is a dryland crop, as you all know, and we found that a fair number of lines of sorghum already have that. Obviously, it must have a benefit, but I think one of the major advantages of sorghum is it gets through its season quicker than, say, corn, and grows a bit slower early in the season, so it does it by its growth rate to save the water. So sorghum does have that advantage and effective use of the water.
How this translates to yield response, how producers might be thinking about management practices that they can be implementing. Where do the genetics and the management come together here with this topic?
Well, what I was talking about was a genetic approach, but of course there are management schemes where you do things to have less water use early in the season by lower density crop, for instance, so that they don't use the water out so fast. You can do that type of thing, and shorter season varieties may also help in that. So there's several approaches you can use. We're just looking at some traits that haven't been there, and we can get them in the material to further help this water savings, more effective use of the water.
Having plant breeders here, having people in the plant science community here, these discussions are ongoing for looking ahead and seeing what's next for some major crops. As a side note, something that you had talked about also in your presentation more briefly was roots and how that relates to traits about rooting depth, and just a brief conversation. And something you had mentioned was that it's a little bit more controversial. There's maybe not quite as much research, but as you had said, that's maybe for good reason because of the labor that goes in and some inconsistencies with environment.
Well, it's very difficult research. I mean, I've been involved in it for, a lot of years. I hate to say how many, off and on. And I get frustrated because the experiments are very difficult. And then when you move it to the field, the natural variability or the variability exists in soils, depths, and characteristics, make application of genetic improvements quite questionable. And after you do that, it's not exactly clear whether you want deeper, faster rooting, which uses the water out quickly and then makes your crop more vulnerable to drought, or you want slow rooting and use the water slowly and then save it for later in the season. So in our studies, and very few people now have ever applied the root characteristics in breeding programs. We've given up. I think it's difficult to really get a consistent benefit from these rooting traits. We did calculations for soybean in western Kansas, which is probably not really very realistic, and that would say there would be a somewhat benefit of deeper rooting for these soybean crops. Well, we haven't really looked at it for corn or sorghum. We could do that, but I think it's the balance, and the problem is every year is different, so we have not come up with a consistent idea of what would be beneficial.
A good note for producers who may have been curious about that at one point or another. Something for producers to keep in mind is signals out in the field of knowing, well, how quickly are my plants using water, and then later in the season, are they withstanding the water amount they have available? Is there a relationship with any of this water conversation to nitrogen fixation?
Oh, and our soybeans, turns out that the nitrogen fixation soybean is extremely sensitive to soil drying. It's the first thing that is responsive to soil drying, and so you have a nitrogen fixation stress virtually in every year with soybean. You visually can't see anything, but we have measured that it has that sensitivity, and it's a trait that we've pursued, given a lot of time to, and we do now have lines that are much more tolerant of that soil drying. But in soybeans, that's probably the major target for us, is overcome that nitrogen fixation sensitivity.
Are there any other next steps that plant scientists here, through the questions or conversations you've had here, are thinking about, or what's on the forefront here for this type of research?
Yeah, well, you just took me off the podium, so I haven't had a chance to talk with anybody. So I know we've done research in cooperation with the folks here on sorghum. We showed in that research that, quote, a figure I described earlier about half the lines expressing this limited transpiration trait came from that research that we did in cooperation with here.
Well, thank you, Tom, for taking some time here as you just presented here at the Plant Science Symposium. Thank you for taking some time with us.
Well, thank you, and I enjoyed the opportunity to discuss this with you.
Once again, that was plant scientist Tom Sinclair from North Carolina State University, one of the presenters here at a Plant Science Symposium on K-State's campus. We'll be back with more and another speaker here from the symposium on agriculture today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. I'm Sarah Moyer here again at the Plant Science Symposium happening on K-State's campus. And another presenter, as promised, is on with us. This time, Professor of Plant Breeding, Mitch Teinstra, Purdue University. Thanks for coming on, Mitch.
Thanks for having me. I really have enjoyed my day here today because I was on the faculty at K-State from 1997 to 2007, so it was great to come home again.
And now at Purdue, you are specializing in corn and sorghum, the, quote, C4 crops, those crops that produce a lot of carbohydrates. And will you give an overview of how your presentation fit into the conference theme of looking towards the future with plant science?
So the topic of my presentation today was about corn and sorghum. Corn and sorghum are close cousins. They're clearly different plants. But a lot of people can't even tell them apart when they're young, so you say they're close cousins, they're relatives of each other. Sorghum was domesticated in Africa, maize domesticated in North America by people a few thousand years ago. They took those wild grasses that existed in those places and they turned them into the crops we know today. In the 1800s, sorghum made its way over to U.S. and became an increasingly important crop in the state of Kansas. And so the topic of my talk today was climate-resilient crops. And so these are going to be crop plants that are adapted to drought and high temperatures and adverse environmental conditions. And there's lots of places in Kansas where farmers struggle with growing these crops under adverse environmental conditions, and Sometimes it's too much rain, sometimes it's not enough rain, sometimes it's too hot, sometimes it's not hot enough, and so it's a difficult question. And so the point that I wanted to bring up is that people ask me about this quite often. It's the area of my research. I'm interested in this topic myself. It's what I do my research in. So we have these two plants that come from different continents and are fundamentally different. We have sorghum that's naturally more resilient to adverse drought-like conditions, and that's why sorghum, or milo as some people call it, it's so important across the south central plains of the United States. And corn isn't quite as tolerant to those stresses, but a lot of people like to grow corn. This is corn country as well. And over the years, the quantities of corn or sorghum that people plant, it all is a function of the risk that they want to take on, and the value proposition changes. What mix of corn and sorghum do I want to try to grow at my farm this year? And it's especially when they think about, I'm going to have this in some rotation with wheat and sunflowers and soybeans maybe, or some other kinds of, it just depends on where I'm at in the state and what I'm trying to do. And so the question becomes, for me, a lot of times when I'm asked the question of what should the farmer do in terms of trying to make a selection, I tell the story this way. Sometimes I look at sorghum and I say, why wouldn't a farmer plant sorghum today? And sometimes it's because in the case of corn, there's this huge private sector industry in terms of developing technology. It has lots of technologies that make it easier to grow, but it's also expensive. Corn seed is expensive, requires oftentimes more nitrogen. Why aren't they growing sorghum? In some cases, there are things about the crop that are problematic. You can't control weeds very well, or it might not have the nutrition profile that I'm looking for, whatever the case may be. And so as a sorghum breeder, a lot of time in my own research program, I'm working on trying to make sorghum at least as good quality-wise as corn. I don't want the farmer to say, I'm not growing sorghum because it's not as good as corn. If he wants to make a choice to grow corn because of the technologies that are available through a seed company, that's fine. But I just don't want the crop to be at a disadvantage from the standpoint of its characteristics otherwise. And so in my program at Purdue, my program is called a trait development program, and so we're incorporating traits that make sorghum more valuable to either animal producers or valuable to people that are growing them for, whether it's for grain or for forage. It depends. At the same time, if they're trying to grow corn isn't as stress tolerant. I work on corn, and I'm trying to enhance corn's ability to thrive in hot and dry environments. And so I have these two examples where I'm trying to make corn more like sorghum in terms of its stress tolerance, or I'm trying to make sorghum more like corn in terms of its nutritional profile and other characteristics.
And one unique example that you talked about was a project related to sorghum that was creating a sorghum variety that did not have durum present in it. That relates to toxicity, and you use the example of if cattle get out and start grazing sorghum at the wrong time, that can be lethal. So illustrate what that project has done, and what kind of questions are you asking now that you've had some trials and had some time to start thinking about what consequences could be in those considerations?
Sure. A lot of people ask me, why don't people grow more forage sorghum? It's really productive. The input costs are low. It's adapted to droughty environments. There's lots of positive things. It's a perennial. It's a lot of positive things about sorghum. But depending on where you are, sorghum is an important forage crop in Kansas. But when you get to Indiana, you don't see a lot of forage sorghums. And the reason is because they're all growing corn silage. Why are they choosing one versus the other? One of the very important reasons why they're making that choice is that sorghum produces a secondary metabolite, produces a molecule, or it produces a chemical or a compound during development called durin. And durin is a cyanogenic glucoside. It's a sugar with cyanide attached to it. And young sorghum plants produce a lot of this. And it turns out that it's very high in young sorghum plants. And so every farmer in Kansas knows you got to be careful with sorghum. You have to be careful how you manage it. You have to be careful how you use it in a feed ration, whether you're using it as hay or using it for ensiling. It can be managed, but you do have to be careful. Well, it turns out if I'm in Indiana and I have a choice of corn versus sorghum, the farmer usually says, I'm going to grow corn because I don't have to deal with the concern. So a few years ago, we said, I wonder if we can modify durin biosynthesis. Durin is this molecule. And so we began a project to see if we could knock out the gene so that the sorghum plants couldn't make this durin. And we were successful, so we now have sorghums in our research program that don't produce any cyanide or any durin. And we've incorporated that trait into grain sorghums, into sorghum sedans, into forages. And we're just now nicely getting to the point where we have experimental hybrids in each of those classes, and we're comparing those with normal cyanide-producing types. And we're assessing what's the nutritional characteristic. Are there any downsides to not having this metabolite there? And this is, I think, a really great example of if a farmer is growing durin-free sorghum or non-cyanide-producing sorghum, it's not a question. It's not something that has to be managed. It's just like corn from the standpoint of its durin status. They're non-cyanide producing. And so now if there are other reasons to grow corn, that's a different, if it's an economic question or some other question about why he might grow corn, that's economics.
And that's just one example of how the plant breeding that you're working on or have worked on so far is giving another option to producers. And just here in brief, when talking about genetics and plant breeding are so closely related now with technology, briefly summarize the work that you're doing to not only look at the genetics or the genomics, those genetic traits, but also the physical traits and going out into the field. You've mentioned several times during your presentation that you like to get out into the field to think about from a producer perspective or from someone being out in a field what could be improved.
There's a new area of science that's emerging in agriculture that really is heavily dependent on the use of sensors in farmers' fields or in agriculture, in addition to other places. We have a research team that I'm working with that we use drones, so these are UAVs, with sensors attached to them, and we fly those over research sites, and then we take the data that's collected on those sensors, and those could be as simple as a camera, or they could be very sophisticated. Many sophisticated new sensors are becoming available. We mount them either on UAVs or these drones, or we actually have tractors that are covered with sensors that we drive through the field. And what we're doing is we're working with engineers to translate that remote sensing information into plant traits. Are these plants happy or are they unhappy? Do they have enough water? Are they too hot? Do they exhibit deficiencies in nitrogen or other kinds of questions? And so we're essentially building the tools to study plants and collect very, very high-resolution data on plants growing in farmers' fields. And the reason why that's so important is if I can collect it digitally, I can come back and look at it later, and it's not so reliant upon me being in the field at a particular time when a particular stress is occurring. And so using these remote sensing platforms allow us to collect data over the growing season and then use that data to interpret what happened in the farmer's field or in a research field.
And a lot of collaboration there going on. You spoke about engineers, computer scientists, all working together to make some improvements and to learn more about what's going on in the field. A lot of exciting information you shared here after your presentation at the Plant Science Symposium. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk again with my friends in Kansas, and that it's been fun to come back and get a chance to see all of my old friends at the university.
That, once again, was Mitch Tynstra, professor of plant breeding at Purdue University. It was good to have him back on campus as a former K-State professor, and once again, he was talking about corn and sorghum and the plant breeding research he's done with it. I'm Sarah Moyer, and we'll be back here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you as we move along to today's agricultural news headlines for you now. These courtesy in part of DTN. Well, because of technical difficulties, the USDA delayed its weekly crop progress and condition report by 1 day. For the week ending this past Sunday here in Kansas, our topsoil moisture supplies were rated at 19% surplus, 71% adequate, only 10% short to very short. Subsoil moisture at 7% surplus, 77% adequate, and 16% short to very short. Winter wheat planting in the state, 3% complete now. That's right on the 5-year average for the date. The condition of the Kansas corn crop, 46% good to excellent, 26% fair, and 28% poor to very poor. Corn now dented at 89%. That's slightly ahead of the average. Corn now mature at 49%. That's ahead of the 35% average. And corn harvest is 9% in now. That's near the average for the date. Soybean crop condition in Kansas, 56% good to excellent, 32% fair, and 12% poor to very poor. Soybeans now setting pods at 95%, equal to the average, and beans dropping leaves at 16%, again near the average. And grain sorghum, 70% good to excellent, 23% fair, 7% poor to very poor. Sorghum now coloring at 74%. The average is 65% for the date. And grain sorghum now mature at 10%, right on the average. Grain sorghum harvest is underway at 2% done now. That's near the average. Range and pasture conditions around the state, 46% good to excellent, 34% fair, and 20% poor to very poor. Nationally, corn and soybean crop condition ratings are up this week. However, that could change later as Hurricane Florence moves in, according to a USDA expert. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Forgotten in all the excitement about Hurricane Florence is that we had a very wet week across the plains in the Midwest.
And the result of that, a bit of improvement in corn and soybean condition ratings nationally as of this past Sunday. USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says the latest crop progress report, the release of which was delayed 20 hours because of technical problems, shows that improvement.
Corn condition now 68% good to excellent, a 1-point uptick in the good to excellent rating from last week.
However, the rains did not help the drought-stricken Missouri corn crop.
44% of the corn crop rated very poor to poor.
Meanwhile, for soybeans nationally,
we also saw improvement. That is not unexpected with late rains. Overall numbers, 68% good to excellent. That's up 2 points from last week.
In Missouri, those rains did help late-planted soybeans.
Missouri, soy, now 27% very poor to poor.
It was 36% 2 weeks ago. Gary Crawford, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue and U.S. Food and Drug Administration Commissioner Scott Gottlieb announced that the two agencies will be holding a joint public meeting in late October on the use of cell culture technology to develop products derived from livestock and poultry. This joint public meeting, hosted by the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service and the FDA, will focus on the potential hazards, the oversight considerations, and the labeling of cell-cultured food products derived from livestock and poultry. The first day of the meeting will focus primarily on the potential hazards that need to be controlled for the safe production of animal cell-cultured food products and oversight considerations by regulatory agencies. The second day of the meeting will focus on the labeling considerations. That session comes as both agencies earlier had been jockeying for position in terms of which agency, the FDA or the USDA, would take the lead in the lab-grown meat regulation field. Partners in the Kansas-based cattle traceability pilot project have officially established Cattle Trace, as it's called, as a not-for-profit corporation. Todd Domer tells us this is an important step in the process.
Creating the organizational structure is key to providing the necessary security to ensure cattle movement data is safe. Producer privacy and data security are critical components of a disease traceability system. Leadership has been chosen for the organization. Brandon Deppenbush with Innovative Livestock Services is chairman of the Cattle Trace Board of Directors. The vice chair is Tom Jones with High Plains Feed Yard of Montezuma. Other board members are Mike Samples with Farmers and Ranchers Livestock of Salina, Ken Stilo with Bar S Ranch at Paradise, and Mark Gardner with Gardner Angus Ranch near Ashland. Cooperators volunteering to participate in the 2-year pilot project include beef processors, feed yards, auction markets, and cow-calf producers. Tyson, Cargill, National Beef, and U.S. Premium Beef all will participate. Feed yards agreeing to be part of the project are Green Plains Cattle Company, High Plains Feed Yard, Finney County Feed Yard, Midwest Feeders, N.A. Timmerman, Cow Camp Beef, Innovative Livestock Services, Fairley Feed Yard, High Choice Feeders, Heritage Beef, Pratt Feeders, and Pokey Feeders. Livestock market cooperators are Farmers and Ranchers Livestock, Winter Livestock in Dodge City, Winter Livestock in Pratt, Mankato Livestock, La Crosse Livestock Market, and the Manhattan Commission Company. Deppenbush said the focus now turns to installation of technology at the Packer, Feed Yard, and Livestock Market facilities. Further recruitment of cow-calf producers is taking place as well. Ranchers who do business with one of the cooperating feed yards or auction markets are encouraged to consider participating. Cattle Trace will collect the minimal data necessary for disease traceability, including date, time, individual animal identification number, and location each time an animal's tag is read. About 55,000 Kansas calves are expected to be tagged for the project. For more information, go to cattletrace.org. I'm Todd Domer.
And a quick calendar item here for you agricultural financiers in the state. K-State's Department of Agricultural Economics will be hosting its annual pair of agricultural lenders conferences in early October, specifically in Garden City, October the 9th, and at the Alumni Center here on the K-State campus in Manhattan on October the 10th. Among the topics that will be covered during the schedule there, the latest on the beef cattle market outlook, including forages and dryland cropping rotations, crop profitability and management factors, the grain market outlook for 2019, the 2018 Farm Bill progress, of course, and land values and rental rates in Kansas, among the topics that will be addressed at the 2018 K-State Agricultural Lenders Conferences. Again, get those on your calendar for Garden City, October the 9th, here in Manhattan on October the 10th. For more specifics on the program and how to register, go to, as always, agmanager.info, agmanager.info. This is Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
I called my friend and told him I needed one of his big rocks, a really big one.
That's Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
To go to campus, you enter Marlette Avenue, coming from Saschild Road, and you go east. It's a turn which at any ball game is busy, as it is one of the ways to reach the football stadium. Turning off Saschild, you enter an easy S-curve. As you proceed, the S-curve, it dips down into a straight stretch of road. If you're on a motorcycle, you open up with a roar. You can lean across the handlebars and give it all she has. That's if you're a fool. Apparently, there are enough fools, as I've heard them while working outside on the hill. And it's not only motorcycles, but low-slung sports cars and some pickups do the same thing. Once through the last curve of the S, they see the long straight road ahead with the downhill, and they roar. The trouble is, The official speed limit is 40 miles per hour, and there is a deer sign, warning for possible deer crossing, and people have been killed. Someday Mallet will be widened to facilitate the increased traffic, but while everybody abides by the rules, there is no problem. However, when we enter Mallet from our steep downhill driveway, we stop and look both ways. Then we look again to make sure no one is roaring through the S-curve and could slam into us as we either cross over to the westbound lane or turn east. There's a double yellow line, but impatient fools going uphill, going west, have crossed the line, and as I have turned east down the road, I have suddenly faced them. Only good brakes saved the day. That and alertness, expecting the unexpected. Even getting the mail can be a challenge. Over the years, I've moved our mailbox from our side of the road, very handy, to the other side. Each spring there are still some red tulips coming up where once the mailbox stood. Now I have to cross the road. But let me tell you, I look both ways before I step out on the road to cross. Years ago, on my way to get the mail and cross the road, I still remember how a small, white pickup truck came through the curve but lost control and aimed straight for me, but veered into the ditch just before the culvert and came to a stop against a tall cottonwood. Stopped with a smoking engine. The driver stepped out with a telephone in his hand and called someone. I think he called a wrecker. I offered to pull the truck out, but he declined. He was not hurt. Surprised, yes. The tree stopped him. The curve is a challenge on icy mornings in wintertime. Black ice is treacherous, but that curve makes it even more so. We have received the mail in the mailbox on either side of the road for over 44 years. Different mail persons have dropped the letters in the box. I've always made sure that the mailbox stood straight, at the right height, so it was no problem to place the mail in the box. We still get a lot of mail, besides all the junk. To be a mail carrier is a special job. Mail must be delivered in all kinds of weather, so the least I can do is make my mailbox stand there, waiting. But you know what? It happened again after the football game, which K-State barely won. My neighbor who lives across the road called me the next morning and said, "When you come down the hill, don't be too surprised. Yours, mine, and the third mailbox have been knocked down and scattered." And so it was. This is the third time in 44 years. Maybe not a bad average, but very annoying. The last time my daughter replaced the damaged box while we were overseas. She did a fantastic job, as I could see, taking apart what was left this time. The pole snapped off and the mailbox was badly dinged up. But my name was still clearly visible and complete on the one side. I took the pieces up the hill, surprisingly calm. I'd called the police just to let them know, and they stopped by while I was gathering up the pieces. Apparently, more mailboxes were down and out. Nice to know that I was not the only one. Now, to hit the mailbox, they must have come up the hill, as I figured, looking at the bent metal support post of my neighbor's mailbox, and the way stuff was scattered. The police officer took notes. I spent Labor Day laboring to get a mailbox back up. No mail delivery that day. I bought a new pole, garden timber size. Then I carefully took apart the top, which held the metal box. I repaired the pieces, gluing some loose splinters. The metal box I studied, and I was able to get back to close to its original form. That was cheaper than buying a quality new one. I like the metal box. It has my name on it. I carefully put it all together again using same nails, straightened out, and used same screws. Then I drove down with the postal digger and 2 bags of ready mix. I dug a deep hole more than 2.5 feet deep, and after scooping seeping water out the new hole, quickly placed the pole with a hard plunk and added the ready mix. With the leveler, I checked to make sure it stood straight. Then I called my friend and told him I needed one of his big rocks, a really big one. That will stop the happy drunk the next time he loses control or just wants to bust a mailbox or 2 full of bravado.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on rural Kansas. That'll do it for our Wednesday edition. Thanks for being along with us. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.